In the shipyards of northern England, the air once shimmered with fire. Men stood against walls of heat and noise, hammering steel into dreams that would float. They were not remembered as heroes, but without them, empires would never have sailed. Listen, if you stand on the banks of the River Clyde in Glasgow today, or along the waterfront in Belfast, or at the old docks of Liverpool, you can almost hear it. The ghost of hammers on steel, the hiss of steam, the roar of furnaces, the shouts of men working in impossible conditions to build impossible things. The iron ships. They changed the world. They connected continents. They carried goods and people and ideas across oceans that had once seemed infinite. They made Britain the most powerful nation on Earth, controlling a quarter of the world's surface through ships that could go anywhere, carry anything, conquer anyone. But the story of the iron ships is not just about power and empire. It's about the men who built them. The riveters and platers, the engineers and labourers, who worked in heat and danger and exhaustion to turn metal into vessels that would outlast them all. Picture a morning in 1850. The sun rises over the River Clyde, but you can barely see it through the smoke. The shipyards stretch along the riverbank for miles, massive yards filled with skeletal ships in various stages of construction. Some are just keels laid down, iron ribs jutting into the air like the bones of great beasts. Others are nearly complete, their hulls towering stories high, waiting to be launched into water they will transform. The sound begins before dawn. The clang of hammers, the rasp of saws, the groan of cranes lifting massive steel plates, the shouting of foremen coordinating hundreds of workers. It's a symphony of industry, chaotic and beautiful and terrible all at once. Men stream through the shipyard gates as the sun clears the horizon. Thousands of them. They wear caps and rough wool clothes stained with oil and rust. They carry lunch pails, bread and cheese if they're lucky, just bread if they're not. Their faces are weathered and scarred. Many are missing fingers, lost to machinery or accidents. Some limp from old injuries that never healed properly. They are young men and old men and boys barely in their teens. They are Scots and Irish and English, drawn to the shipyards by the promise of work, however dangerous. They are the skilled craftsmen who can read blueprints and calculate stress loads, and they are the labourers who simply know how to swing a hammer for 14 hours straight. They built the ships that built the empire, and they did it with their hands and their backs and their lives. This is their story, the story of the transition from wooden sailing ships to iron and steel vessels that could cross any ocean. The story of how Britain became the workshop of the world, building ships for every navy and merchant fleet on Earth. The story of technology and ambition and human cost. It's the story of the men who built the iron ships. In the beginning, the idea of an iron ship seemed absurd, laughable, physically impossible. Iron sinks. Everyone knows this. Drop a chunk of iron into water and it plummets to the bottom. Wood floats. This is natural law, observable fact, the way the world works. Ships have been made of wood for thousands of years. Oak and pine and teak, carefully shaped and sealed with tar and pitch. The great sailing ships of the Royal Navy, the merchant vessels that carried goods across the seas, the fishing boats that fed coastal towns, all wood. Why would anyone try to build a ship from iron? The answer, as with so many impossible ideas, began with necessity and curiosity. By the early 1800s, Britain was running out of suitable timber for shipbuilding. Centuries of cutting down forests for ships and fuel had depleted the supply. Good oak for a ship's hull was increasingly expensive and hard to find. Meanwhile, Britain's iron industry was booming. Furnaces and forges were producing iron in quantities never before imagined, at prices that kept falling. A few visionaries wondered, could iron be used for shipbuilding, not for decorative elements or fittings, but for the hull itself? The skeptics were legion. Naval architects declared it would never work. The weight would be too great. The ship would sink the moment it touched water. Even if you could somehow make it float, it would be too rigid, unable to flex with the waves the way wooden ships did. It would crack apart in the first storm. Sailors were even more opposed. There was superstition mixed with their practical concerns. Iron was unnatural for ships. It would attract lightning. It would interfere with compasses. It would be cursed by the sea itself. But a few stubborn innovators persisted. The first iron vessels were small, not ships but boats, barges for canals and rivers. In 1787, a man named John Wilkinson built an iron barge called the Trial. When he launched it, crowds gathered to watch it sink. They were stunned when it floated. The iron hull, properly shaped, displaced enough water to create buoyancy. It worked. But a canal barge is not a seagoing ship. The real test would come with larger vessels facing ocean waves and storms. In 1821, a small iron steamship called the Aaron Manby was built in London. It was only 120 feet long, designed for river and coastal trade. When it made a successful voyage from London to Paris, sailing across the English Channel, it proved that iron ships could handle open water. But it was still an oddity, a curiosity. The real shipbuilding industry continued with wood. The breakthrough came in 1843. A man named Isambard Kingdom Brunel, already famous as an engineer, designed the SS Great Britain. It was massive for its time, 322 feet long, powered by both sail and a revolutionary screw propeller, and most importantly, built entirely of iron. When the Great Britain was launched in Bristol, it was the largest ship in the world. And it worked. It sailed across the Atlantic, carrying passengers and cargo reliably for years. It survived storms that would have destroyed wooden ships. It proved, beyond any doubt, that iron ships were not just possible but superior. The floodgates opened. If the Great Britain could do it, so could others. Shipbuilders across Britain began experimenting with iron construction. The Royal Navy, initially resistant, started ordering iron warships. Merchant companies commissioned iron steamers for their fleets. But iron had limitations. It was heavy, it rusted, it was expensive to work with compared to wood. The real transformation would come with the next innovation, steel. Steel is iron refined and strengthened through a process that removes impurities and adds carbon in precise amounts. It's lighter than iron, stronger, more resistant to corrosion. But for most of history, steel was extremely expensive to produce, made in small batches for swords and tools. That changed in the 1850s with the invention of the Bessemer process. Henry Bessemer discovered a way to mass-produce steel by blowing air through molten iron, burning out impurities quickly and cheaply. Suddenly, steel was affordable, and suddenly, steel ships became possible. By the 1860s, the transition was complete. The future of shipbuilding was not wood. It was not even iron. It was steel. And Britain, with its vast iron and steel industries, its engineering expertise, its global merchant fleet and naval power, was perfectly positioned to dominate this new era. The shipyards of the Clyde, the Tyne, the Mersey, and Belfast would become the most productive in the world. They would build thousands of ships. They would employ hundreds of thousands of workers. They would make Britain the undisputed master of the seas. But first, they had to learn how to build in steel, how to shape it, how to join it, how to turn flat plates and heavy beams into hulls that could carry thousands of tons across the world's oceans. This is where the workers enter the story, because while engineers could design steel ships, only skilled craftsmen could actually build them. And the work would prove to be some of the most difficult, dangerous, and demanding labor ever created. Step into a shipyard in 1880, not as a visitor, but as a worker, as someone who will spend the next year of their life building a single ship from the keel up. The first thing that strikes you is the scale. The shipyard stretches across acres of waterfront property. There are dozens of building slips, inclined platforms where the ships are constructed. Some slips hold ships just beginning, others hold vessels nearly ready to launch. Massive gantry cranes tower over everything, their iron arms reaching out to lift steel plates weighing several tons. The noise is overwhelming. Hammering echoes from every direction. Steam hammers, mechanical devices powered by steam pressure, pound rivets with regular, thunderous beats. Hand hammers wielded by teams of riveters add to the cacophony. Metal being cut or shaped screams. Foremen shout orders. Steam whistles blow to signal shift changes or lunch breaks. The air is thick with smoke and steam. Coal-fired furnaces heat rivets to red-hot temperatures. Welding torches, when they're introduced later, add brilliant arcs of light and showers of sparks. The smell is distinctive: hot metal, coal smoke, oil, paint, and the river itself, often polluted with industrial waste. You report to your foreman. You're a riveter, one of the most important jobs in the shipyard. Ships are built by assembling thousands of steel plates, joining them together into a watertight hull. The joints are made with rivets, short metal bolts that are heated until glowing, then hammered through holes in overlapping plates, forming a permanent fastening as they cool and contract. Riveting requires a team. The heater works at a portable forge, keeping rivets at the right temperature. The catcher stands ready with tongs to catch the red-hot rivet when the heater tosses it. You're the holder-on, positioned inside the hull, pressing a heavy iron bar against the rivet head to keep it in place. Your partner is the riveter, outside the hull with a pneumatic hammer, who will pound the protruding end of the rivet until it mushrooms into a second head, locking the plates together. The work is brutal. The heat from the glowing rivets is intense. Working inside the hull, you're often in confined spaces, sometimes barely large enough to fit your body. The noise of the hammer is deafening. The vibration travels through the rivet, and the steel plates into your body, shaking your bones, making your teeth rattle. You do this hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a week. A single large ship might require 3 million rivets. 3 million times the process must be repeated perfectly. A bad rivet means a weak point in the hull. A weak point means potential disaster when the ship faces a storm at sea. The danger is constant. Hot rivets sometimes miss their target when tossed, bouncing off steel and landing on workers. Burns are common. The forges and torches create fire hazards. Working at height on scaffolding or inside partially built hulls means the risk of falling. Heavy plates lifted by cranes can shift or swing, crushing anyone in their path. Industrial accidents are not unusual. They're expected. Every shipyard has its stories of men killed or maimed. A riveter who lost his hand when it got caught between the hammer and the hull. A plater who fell 3 stories when scaffolding collapsed. A heater who died from burns after a forge explosion. There's no compensation for injuries, no insurance. If you're hurt too badly to work, you're simply replaced. Your family, if you have one, must survive without your wages. The shipyard moves on without you. The ship must be completed on schedule. The hours are long. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week is standard. During rush orders or when launch dates approach, you might work 14 or 16 hours. There are no breaks except for meals. You eat lunch sitting where you work, often still holding your tools, ready to resume the moment the break ends. The pay is better than many other jobs. Skilled shipyard workers are among the better paid industrial laborers. But it's still not much. Just enough to support a family if you're careful. Not enough to save. Not enough to retire on. Most shipyard workers expect to work until their bodies give out or they're killed in an accident. But there's pride in the work. Deep, unspoken pride. You're building something magnificent. Not a factory product, not a widget or a tool. A ship. A vessel that will sail the world. That will carry people and goods across oceans. That will represent Britain in foreign ports. That might last 50 or 100 years, long after you're gone. You can see your work taking shape. At the beginning, there's just a keel, the backbone of the ship. Then the frames go up, vertical ribs that define the hull's shape. Then the plates begin to be fitted, bottom to top, inside and out, transforming the skeleton into something solid and real. Slowly, over months, the ship grows. The hull takes form. The decks are laid. The superstructure rises. The funnels, smokestacks, are installed, towering high. The propeller shaft is fitted, running from the engine room to the stern. The rudder is hung. And you know that every piece, every plate, every rivet was placed by someone like you, by hands like yours. by skills learned over years of apprenticeship and practice. The ship is not built by machines, though machines help. It's built by craftsmen, by human judgment and human strength and human perseverance. There's an art to riveting. A perfect rivet is hot enough to deform under the hammer, but not so hot it weakens. It must be driven at the right angle, with the right force, to create a tight, strong joint. You can hear the difference in the sound. A good rivet rings clear and bright. A bad one sounds dull. Experienced riveters can tell just by listening whether their work is sound. There's artistry in plating too. Steel plates must be shaped to follow the curves of the hull. Some curves are gentle, others sharp. The platers use hydraulic presses and furnaces to bend steel into the exact shapes needed. It requires understanding forces and stresses, knowing how metal behaves under heat and pressure. It's engineering and craftsmanship combined. The ship takes on character as it's built. Workers begin to identify with it. This is their ship. They argue about its design, speculate about how it will perform, take personal offense if anyone suggests it might not be the finest vessel ever built. They know its quirks and features more intimately than its future captain will. When problems arise, and they always do, the workers improvise solutions. A plate that doesn't quite fit, a frame that's slightly misaligned, equipment that breaks. The official drawings and plans are important, but the real knowledge is in the workers' heads and hands. They know what will work and what won't. They know how to adapt, to make do, to achieve the impossible with limited resources. The shipyard becomes a kind of cathedral, not a religious space, but a place of creation and purpose. The ships rising on the slips are like cathedral spires, reaching toward the sky. The work has its own rituals and rhythms, its own traditions passed from masters to apprentices. There's a sense of being part of something larger than yourself, of building something that will outlast you. Visitors to the great shipyards are always awed by what they see. The sheer size of the ships under construction, the complexity of the work, the orchestration of thousands of workers, each performing their specific task, all coordinating to create these massive vessels. But visitors see the shipyard for a few hours and then leave. The workers live it. Day after day, year after year. Their bodies bear the marks, burn scars, calloused hands, damaged hearing from the noise, lung problems from breathing metal dust and coal smoke. Their lives are shaped by the rhythm of the shipyard. Wake before dawn, work all day, return home exhausted, sleep, repeat. They are building the future, building the empire, building the ships that will connect the world. But they're also sacrificing their health, their time, their very lives to do it. The ships are monuments to human achievement, but they're also monuments to human cost. By the 1890s, Britain was building more ships than the rest of the world combined. The shipyards of Glasgow alone produced a quarter of the world's tonnage. Add in Liverpool, Belfast, Newcastle, and the other centres of British shipbuilding, and the dominance was absolute. These were not just commercial vessels, they were instruments of empire. The ships built in British yards carried the British Empire across the globe. They transporting troops to colonial possessions in India, Africa, Australia. They carried raw materials from those colonies back to Britain, cotton from India, diamonds from South Africa, wool from Australia, tea from Ceylon. They carried manufactured goods from British factories to markets worldwide. The ships were the arteries of empire, and the shipyards were its beating heart. Consider the scale of ambition. In the 1860s, Britain began building a new class of warship, ironclad battleships. These were not the wooden ships of Nelson's era, but steel fortresses mounting enormous guns. HMS Warrior, launched in 1860, was the most powerful warship in the world. She was also the largest iron ship built to that point. Building such a ship required coordination of staggering complexity. The hull alone required thousands of tons of steel plate. The armor, thick iron plates bolted to the hull, added thousands more tons. The engines were massive, generating enough power to push this enormous weight through water at speeds wooden ships could never match. The guns were engineering marvels in themselves, each one weighing as much as a house. And it all had to work together. The ship had to be strong enough to absorb cannon fire, stable enough not to capsize under the weight of its armor and guns, fast enough to catch enemy vessels, reliable enough to sail thousands of miles without breaking down. The workers who built these ships understood, at least partially, what they meant. They were building power, British power. These warships would enforce British dominance of the seas, protect British merchant shipping, project British military might to any corner of the globe. There was pride in that. Britain, a small island, ruled a quarter of the Earth's landmass, and it did so primarily through naval power, through ships built here in these yards by these hands. But the commercial ships were equally important to the empire. The great passenger liners that connected Britain to America, to India, to Australia. The cargo ships that kept the empire's trade flowing. The smaller vessels that serviced every port in the British sphere of influence. By 1900, Britain owned nearly half the world's merchant shipping. Most of it was built in British yards. The maritime dominance was total. British ships, carrying British goods, flying the British flag, dominated global trade. The shipyards had become vast industrial complexes. The Harland and Wolff yard in Belfast, which would later build the Titanic, employed 15,000 workers at its peak. The yards on the Clyde employed even more. These were cities within cities, complete with their own infrastructure, railways to bring in steel and coal, docks to launch the finished ships, workshops and forges and engineering facilities. The social impact was profound. Entire towns existed primarily to support the shipyards. Generations of families worked in the yards. Boys followed their fathers into the trade, learning skills passed down through the family. Shipyard work became an identity, a culture, a way of life. The workers developed their own traditions and hierarchies. Master craftsmen, men who had decades of experience, commanded respect and higher wages. Apprentices started young, learning by watching and doing, gradually progressing from simple tasks to skilled work. There was pride in being a shipyard man, in possessing skills that could turn steel into floating vessels. The ships themselves became famous. The great liners, Mauretania, Lusitania, Olympic, Titanic, were celebrities. Their launches were major events, attended by thousands, covered by newspapers worldwide. When a new ship slid down the slipway into the water for the first time, it was a moment of triumph, proof that British engineering and British craftsmanship remained supreme. The empire depended on these ships in ways both obvious and subtle. The obvious, military power, trade, transportation of people and goods. The subtle, the psychological impact of British ships in every major port in the world. The way they reinforced the idea of British supremacy. The way they made the vast distances of empire manageable. A letter from London could reach India in weeks instead of months. Troops could be deployed to trouble spots quickly. Raw materials could flow to British factories efficiently. Products could reach global markets while still competitive, all because of the ships. And the ships existed because of the workers. The riveters and platers and engineers and labourers who turned steel into vessels. They were the foundation of empire, though they were rarely acknowledged as such. The glory went to the engineers who designed the ships, to the owners who commissioned them, to the captains who sailed them. The men who built them remained largely anonymous, their names forgotten even as their work endured. But they knew. Even if the world didn't acknowledge it, they understood their importance. They saw the fruits of their labor sailing out of the yards, heading for adventures and destinations they would never see themselves. They heard the stories of ships they built performing heroically in storms or battles. They took quiet pride in knowing that their rivets held, that their work was sound, that the ships they built could be trusted with precious cargo and human lives. The empire was built on many things: military force, economic exploitation, political maneuvering, cultural influence. But it floated on ships. And those ships were built by men whose hands were scarred by hot rivets, whose backs were bent from years of labor, whose lungs were damaged by breathing industrial air, whose hearing was ruined by the endless hammering. They were the unseen foundation of everything. Stand in a shipyard cemetery. They exist in Glasgow, in Belfast, in Liverpool. Small, often neglected burial grounds where shipyard workers and their families were laid to rest. Walk among the headstones and you'll see the story written in stone. John MacLeod, riveter, died age 32. Cause of death not listed, but you can guess. Industrial accident. A fall, a crushing injury, a burn that became infected. William Thompson, plater, died age 45. Probably lung disease. Years of breathing metal dust and coal smoke destroying his ability to draw breath. Drowning slowly in air. Robert Fraser, age 14, apprentice. Too young. Killed before he had a chance to become a master craftsman. Before he had a chance to live. The Grave tell a story the history books often omit. The human cost of building the iron ships. Industrial accidents were endemic. Despite the skill of the workers, despite increasing safety awareness, the work was simply too dangerous for accidents to be avoided. Heavy machinery, extreme heat, working at height, confined spaces, the sheer scale of the operations, all created hazards. Some accidents were spectacular. In 1901, a boiler exploded during the fitting out of a ship in a Belfast yard. 5 workers were killed instantly. Dozens more were injured. The explosion could be heard across the city. For days afterward, families waited anxiously for news, wondering if their husbands and sons had survived. But most accidents were mundane. A worker misstepping on a gangplank and falling into the hold. A rivet that went astray and struck someone in the eye. A plate that shifted while being lifted and crushed a man against a bulkhead. These small tragedies happened regularly, almost routinely. They were noted in the yard's records, investigated briefly if at all, and then forgotten. The families of killed workers received little. There was no life insurance, no compensation system. Some yards might offer a small payment out of charity, enough to cover the funeral. Some offered nothing at all. Widows and children were left to fend for themselves, often ending up in workhouses or relying on the charity of neighbors who were themselves struggling. Even workers who survived faced long-term health consequences. Hearing loss was universal among riveters. The constant hammering destroyed eardrums. Many older shipyard workers were partially or completely deaf. They communicated through gesture and lip reading, unable to hear the voices of their grandchildren. Lung diseases were common. Pneumonia from working in cold, damp conditions. Tuberculosis spreading through overcrowded housing. But most insidious was pneumoconiosis, a scarring of the lungs caused by inhaling metal dust and other industrial particles. Workers called it dust lung. Doctors had no treatment for it. Men with dust lungs slowly suffocated, their lungs no longer able to absorb enough oxygen. They died gasping for air, drowning in their own damaged tissue. Burns scarred bodies and faces. Lost fingers and hands were so common that workers with all 10 fingers intact were unusual in the older generation. Back problems from years of heavy labor left men bent and unable to stand straight. Hernias from lifting were frequent. Arthritis twisted joints prematurely, turning 40-year-old workers into old men. The life expectancy of shipyard workers was significantly lower than the general population. A worker who started in the yards at age 14 might be dead by 40. If he made it to 50, he was considered lucky. 60 was rare. Retirement was often a brief prelude to death. The body, pushed beyond its limits for decades, simply gave out once the labor stopped. The work consumed lives in other ways too. The long hours meant workers had little time for family. They left home before their children woke and returned after they were asleep. Sundays, the one day off, were often spent recovering from the week's exhaustion, too tired for anything but rest. Fathers barely knew their children. Marriages were strained by the stress and poverty. Children growing up in shipyard families often went hungry. Wages, while better than some industries, were barely adequate. A sick day meant no pay. An injury meant no income while recovering. There were no safety nets. Families lived on the edge of destitution, one misfortune away from disaster. The housing was poor. Shipyard workers lived in cramped tenements near the yards, often whole families in 1 or 2 rooms. Sanitation was primitive. Disease spread easily. Infant mortality was high. Many shipyard workers buried multiple children before those children reached their 5th birthday. And yet, despite all this, despite the danger and the hardship and the poverty, the work continued. Men showed up at the shipyard gates every morning. They climbed the scaffolding, picked up their tools, and did the brutal, dangerous work of building ships. Why? Partly because there was no alternative. The shipyards were often the only major employer in their region. If you wanted to work, if you wanted to feed your family, you worked in the yards. The choice was between dangerous work and starvation. But there was more to it than mere necessity. There was pride, skill, identity. The shipyard workers were among the elite of industrial labor. Their work required training and expertise. They were craftsmen, not merely muscle. That meant something. It gave them dignity in a world that offered little to working people. There was solidarity, too. The dangers and hardships created bonds among workers. They looked out for each other, helped each other when they could, defended each other against abusive foremen, honored each other's sacrifices. And there was the work itself, the ships, building something that mattered, that would last, that would go out into the world and do great things. That counted for something. It made the suffering bearable, gave it purpose. An old riveter, interviewed in the 1950s when the shipyards were beginning their decline, was asked if he regretted his life in the yards. He was 70 then, nearly deaf, stooped from decades of labor, his hands gnarled with arthritis. He thought for a long moment before answering. Regret it? No, I built ships, real ships. I put 3 million rivets into the hull of the Queen Mary. 3 million times I held the iron while my partner hammered. My rivets held. That ship crossed the Atlantic hundreds of times, carrying thousands of people. It sailed through storms that would have sunk wooden ships, and it never leaked. Not one of my rivets failed. He paused, looking at his damaged hands. It cost me, my hearing, my health, years of my life. Lost friends to accidents. Buried my own son when a crane cable snapped and dropped a plate on him. The work was hard, harder than anything you can imagine today. Another pause. But I built ships, and they were good ships, the best in the world. That means something. That has to mean something. He was right. It did mean something. It still does. The human cost was real and enormous. The sacrifices were genuine. The suffering was not abstract but deeply personal, felt in broken bodies and broken families and lost lives. But the ships were real too, and they changed the world. And they could not have been built without the men who paid that cost, who made those sacrifices, who endured that suffering. To remember the ships without remembering the men who built them is to tell only half the story. The ships were monuments to human achievement, but they were also monuments to human cost. Both truths must be held together. The iron ships were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Beautiful in their design and capability. Terrible in what they demanded from those who built them. The dominance couldn't last forever. Nothing does. By the mid-20th century, the British shipbuilding industry was in decline. Not sudden collapse, but gradual fading. Like a great ship rusting away at anchor, magnificent once, but slowly being consumed by time and elements. The causes were many. Other nations industrialized and built their own shipyards. Japan, Korea, China developed shipbuilding industries that could undercut British prices. Labor was cheaper elsewhere. Regulations were less strict. Governments subsidized their industries in ways Britain did not or could not. Technology changed too. Welding began replacing riveting in the 1930s and 40s. It was faster, required fewer workers, created stronger joints. The art of riveting, that hard-won skill passed down through generations, became obsolete almost overnight. The armies of riveters who had built the great ships found themselves unnecessary. Automation came to the shipyards. Machines could cut and shape steel more precisely than hand tools. Cranes and lifting equipment reduced the need for manual labor. Computer-aided design replaced the traditional methods of lofting and templating. Each technological advance made the old skills less relevant, the old workers less necessary. The demand changed as well. The age of the great passenger liners ended with the rise of air travel. Why spend 5 days crossing the Atlantic by ship when you could fly in hours? The grand liners that had been the pride of British shipbuilding became economically unviable. Tourism continued, but it shifted to cruise ships, and those were increasingly built in foreign yards. The orders declined. Year by year, fewer ships were laid down in British yards. Yards that had employed thousands cut their workforce to hundreds, then to dozens, then closed entirely. The closures were devastating to the communities that had grown up around the shipyards. These were towns where 3 or 4 generations of the same family had worked in the yards, where the entire local economy depended on shipbuilding, where identity itself was tied to being a shipyard worker. When the yards closed, it wasn't just jobs that were lost. It was a way of life. It was purpose and pride and tradition. It was the social fabric that held communities together. By the 1980s, most of the great British shipyards were gone. The yards on the Clyde that had produced thousands of ships were silent. Harland and Wolff in Belfast, once the largest shipyard in the world, hung on, but employed only a fraction of its former workforce. The waterfront in Liverpool, once lined with building slips and bustling with activity, became vacant land awaiting redevelopment. The physical structures were demolished or repurposed. The great gantry cranes were torn down. The building slips were filled in. The workshops and forges were gutted or converted to other uses. Museums and apartments and shopping centres rose where ships had once been built. Walk along the Clyde today and you'll see modern developments. Expensive flats with river views, restaurants and bars. A few preserved buildings with plaques explaining their historical significance. But the shipyards themselves, gone, almost completely erased from the landscape. The men who had worked there scattered. Some found other work, though rarely as well paid or as skilled. Some retrained for new careers, struggling to learn new trades in middle age. Some never worked again, living on unemployment benefits or early retirement, watching their old neighborhoods change beyond recognition. The skills died with them. Riveting, as it was practiced in the great age of shipbuilding, is essentially a lost art. There are a few people who still know how, mostly elderly men who learned as apprentices before the technique became obsolete. But when they die, the knowledge dies with them. You can read about riveting in books, see old films of men at work, but the tacit knowledge, the feel of a properly heated rivet, the sound of a good joint forming, the subtle adjustments required for different conditions, that exists only in the hands and minds of those who did it for years. The same is true of many other shipbuilding skills, plate bending by eye and experience, lofting full-scale patterns on mold loft floors, the countless small techniques and tricks that master craftsmen knew and used, but never wrote down because they were learned by doing, not by reading. All of this is fading into history, into memory, into the archives and museums that try, inadequately, to preserve something of what was lost. But memory is fragile. The men who built the ships are dying. Those who remain are very old now, their memories dimming, their voices rarely heard. Their children and grandchildren know the stories, but second-hand, already abstracted from the lived reality. Another generation or two, and even the stories will fade. What remains? The ships themselves, at least some of them. A few have been preserved as museums or tourist attractions. HMS Warrior, that first iron battleship, survives as a museum ship in Portsmouth. SS Great Britain, Brunel's revolutionary vessel, was rescued from abandonment and restored in Bristol. The Cutty Sark, though a sailing ship rather than a steamer, represents the transition era and sits in dry dock in London. But most of the ships are gone, scrapped for their metal, sunk in wars, lost at sea, broken up when they became uneconomical to maintain. The thousands upon thousands of ships built in British yards have vanished, leaving only records and photographs and memories. The shipyard cemeteries remain, though they're often neglected. Weeds grow between the headstones. Names fade from weathered stone. Few visitors come to pay respects to men who died a century ago, whose connection to the present